The prairie was quiet that evening, too quiet for a land used to carrying the weight of hooves, drums, and wind-carried warnings. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a fire crackled low, and beside it stood a woman whose heart no longer followed the path her people had carved for her. She was the daughter of a war chief, the blood of warriors flowing through her veins. She had been promised to a hunter, a man who had killed wolves with his bare hands. But she chose another, a man the tribe called Invisible, a poor farmer who owned nothing but calloused hands and eyes that never lied. They called her Wiaka. It meant feather, but there was nothing delicate about her decision. It came not with ceremony or permission, but with a whisper, a step, and a kiss that shattered everything. The moment she left her father's lodge and walked barefoot to the edge of the valley where the farmer lived, every elder knew something had broken. And when she stood beside him before sunset, her hand in his, the sky did not weep, it watched. He had no horse, no name worth remembering. His cabin was falling in on itself. But Wiaka saw something her people had long forgotten how to recognize, truth that did not need armor. And in a world that punished weakness and honored bloodlines, she chose kindness, steadiness, the strength to remain soft in a land that worshipped steel. But not everyone saw it that way. Back at the camp, her father, Chief Takota, sat in silence until the fire burned low. Then he rose, turned to the circle of warriors, and said only one word: revenge. Not against the man who took his daughter, because the farmer had taken nothing, but against the daughter who gave herself away. In his eyes, it was betrayal not just of family, but of honor. And in the old ways of his people, betrayal demanded fire. By dawn, blood would be demanded. But what neither side knew yet, what the land itself held its breath to witness, was that love born in truth does not run from war. It reshapes it. The sun hadn't yet touched the edge of the world when Takota gathered the warriors. No one dared question him. His daughter's betrayal was not just personal, it was spiritual. For a chief's blood to mingle with that of a man outside the circle, and worse, a poor white farmer, was to spit upon the laws that bound the tribe's very identity. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. His words came like iron wrapped in smoke. Before the moon rises again, she must remember who she is, or be forgotten forever. The warriors nodded, not out of loyalty, but fear. Meanwhile, across the valley, the poor farmer, whose name was Caleb, split wood with hands that still trembled from the night before. Wiaka had not left. She sat on the porch, wrapped in one of his rough-spun blankets, her eyes fixed on the hills she once called home. Caleb wanted to speak, to ask why she would do something that could cost her everything. But every time he opened his mouth, she simply reached for his hand and held it. No answers, just presence. That morning, it was enough. By midday, the wind shifted. Caleb noticed it first, not by the leaves, but by the stillness of the birds. Then, a rider appeared, not a warrior, a child, barefoot, out of breath. He brought a message wrapped in fur: leave by nightfall or face what comes. Wiaka read it with a calm only earned by those who have lived too many lives in one lifetime. They won't wait, she said. Caleb didn't argue. He didn't beg her to flee. He just asked, do you want me to run? And she said, if I wanted a man to run, I would have stayed home. That afternoon, she braided her hair in silence, the same way her mother had done before every moon dance. But this wasn't for ceremony. This was for war. Not a war of swords or arrows, but of meaning. She wasn't fighting for Caleb. She was fighting for her choice. And in a world where women were seen but not heard, where duty outweighed desire, that fight was more dangerous than any weapon. As the sun sank into the soil, the sound of drums began to roll over the horizon like distant thunder. Caleb lit a single lantern. Wiaka stood beside him barefoot, chin lifted, eyes locked on the dark ridge ahead. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't hiding. And for the first time in his life, Caleb understood what it meant for someone to be rooted. Not in place, but in purpose. The reckoning was near. But what they didn't know was that love had already changed the battlefield. The first rider crossed the stream at dusk, face painted with coal and ash. Behind him came 5 more, each one cloaked in deer hide, each one a keeper of old oaths. They didn't ride in haste. They moved like judgment given flesh. Takota followed on foot, his steps slow, deliberate, as though each stride carved a new law into the ground. He held no weapon. His hands were empty, but his presence struck harder than any blade. This was not a rescue. This was retribution, cloaked in ceremony. Caleb stepped down from the porch, not to posture, but to be seen. He had no weapon either, only the lantern in one hand, and Wiaka's hand in the other. The flames flickered between them like a fragile treaty. Tuckota stopped a dozen steps away. His eyes didn't find Caleb. They found his daughter. "You were born of fire," he said, "but you chose to walk with water." Wiaka didn't blink. "Because fire consumes," she answered, "and water remembers." The warriors murmured, shifting. This was not how trials were spoken. But this was no ordinary trial. Wiaka stepped forward, releasing Caleb's hand. "If I return," she said to her father, "it will not be in chains. It will be in truth. But if you take him from this land, then you will not just lose a daughter. You will lose the memory of who I really am." Her voice cracked only once, on the word memory. It echoed louder than any scream. Tuckota raised his hand. The warriors stopped. Silence. Even the wind dared not speak. "Then prove," he said, "that this man has the strength to carry what our blood has bled for. Not through words, not through waiting, through the right." Caleb didn't understand, but Wiaka did. Her breath caught. The rite was not survival. It was revelation. A ritual meant to strip a soul bare and show the tribe whether it deserved a place among them. It had broken warriors before. Caleb nodded without asking. "Tell me what to do," he said. Wiaka looked at him, tears now gathering, not from fear, but from something deeper. "Pride. You walk alone," she whispered, "and you come back carrying nothing but who you are." The warriors cleared a path. The rite would begin at moonrise, and by dawn, the tribe would know if the farmer was meant to be forgotten or remembered forever. They took him to the edge of the canyon under moonlight, where the earth cracked like a wound and the wind whistled low, as if warning. Caleb was given no food, no fire, no blade, only a strip of cloth to blindfold him and a single rule: walk until the silence ends. What lay ahead was not marked by trail or torch. The rite was not meant to test his strength, but his truth. And in the Old West, truth was a heavier burden than any rifle could carry. Back at the valley, Wiaka sat by the lantern, untouched. No one spoke to her. No one sat beside her. Even her mother turned away. But she didn't move. Not when the elders whispered. Not when her father paced behind her like a hawk circling prey. She only stared at the canyon. She wasn't waiting for Caleb. She was waiting for the land to answer. Because in her heart, she already knew. It wasn't about whether he would return. It was about what would return with him. Inside the canyon, Caleb walked until the stars disappeared behind stone. The wind changed. The temperature dropped. He heard water somewhere in the dark, but when he reached for it, he fell, hard, cutting his hands against shale. Blood marked the rock. But he didn't stop. He whispered names as he walked. His mother, who died with dust on her lips. His brother, buried under a broken plow. Wiaka, who had seen him before he knew how to be seen. Each name gave him another step. Each memory pushed him deeper into the hollowed earth. He didn't know how long he'd been inside when the silence broke, not with a sound, but with a feeling. Warmth. It crept up his spine like a forgotten fire. He removed the blindfold and found himself in a clearing, lit by moonlight pouring through a crack in the canyon's roof. There, in the center, sat a single stone wrapped in red cloth. He knelt. He didn't speak. He didn't pray. He simply placed his hand on the stone and waited. And for a moment, just a moment, the ground beneath him hummed. Not violently, gently, like breath. The land had seen him. It had read his scars, heard his silence, tasted the truth beneath his ribs. When he opened his eyes again, the canyon seemed wider, lighter, not welcoming but accepting. He stood. No voice declared him worthy. No sky split open in glory. But as he turned to walk back, he knew he was no longer just a man. He was a message. He returned before dawn. The tribe had gathered at the ridge, silent as stone. Wiaka stood alone in the center, her face streaked with the cold air of waiting, her eyes locked on the canyon's mouth. When Caleb emerged, torn, bleeding, but walking tall, no one breathed. The rite had no judge, only witnesses, and every person there knew what they saw. A man who walked into nothing, and returned with himself intact. Tuckoda stepped forward, his face unreadable, eyes fixed on the red cloth in Caleb's hand. The chief reached for it, unwrapped it slowly, and revealed what lay within. A single feather, pressed flat and soaked with dust. Not from a bird. From the valley. A symbol. A message. In tribal tradition, such a feather meant only one thing: balance. The land had not favored Caleb. It had not rejected him. It had simply received him. For a long while, no one moved. Then, one by one, the warriors lowered their heads, not in defeat, but in recognition. They had seen many fight to prove themselves. But Caleb had not fought. He had walked. And that, in the eyes of the earth, was the greater victory. Tuckoda turned, locking eyes with his daughter. For a brief second, something cracked in him. Not his pride, but his fear. And in that crack, love slipped through. He stepped aside. No word was spoken. No ceremony was performed. Wiaka crossed the space between them and placed her hand in Caleb's. The circle around them widened, not out of obligation, out of honor. And though the fire was dying, its light stretched far enough to show every face. Warrior, elder, child, bathed in something sacred. Not forgiveness, not tradition, but beginning. The days that followed felt like walking through a dream wrapped in dust. Caleb didn't speak much about what he had seen inside the canyon, but something in him had shifted. He carried silence differently now. Not like a burden, but like a lantern. Wherever he stepped, people listened. Not because he demanded respect, but because he no longer needed it. The land had spoken for him, and that voice echoed louder than any man ever could. Wiaka remained by his side, but she too had changed. She was no longer just the daughter of a chief or the woman who defied tradition. She had become a symbol of something more dangerous than rebellion: renewal. Girls in the tribe began to braid feathers into their hair, not because it was custom, but because it reminded them of choice. Elders watched them in silence. No new laws were written, but a new language had begun to form, spoken through action, not permission. Tuckoda watched it all from a distance. He didn't smile. He didn't protest. But those closest to him noticed the change. He walked slower, spoke softer. Some said he had aged 10 winters in 10 days. Others whispered that the weight of legacy was finally cracking under the truth of love. But he never stopped being chief. Instead, he began to observe, not as a ruler, but as a man slowly learning to unlearn. And that, for a leader like Tuckoda, was its own kind of courage. One morning, Wiaka brought Caleb into the medicine lodge. It was the first time a man from outside the bloodline had ever crossed its threshold. Inside, the women had prepared a space, not with ceremony, but with intention. They placed a circle of crushed leaves around his feet and asked nothing of him. They simply listened as Wiaka told their story, not as legend, but as lived truth. The lodge didn't reject him. It received him, the same way the canyon had. And when they stepped out again, the tribe no longer saw two people caught in defiance. They saw two roots, deeply planted, growing side by side. What had begun as betrayal had transformed into something sacred. An act of remembering that love, when chosen without fear, has the power to restore not just hearts, but entire peoples. But the past never disappears quietly. One night, a fire was lit on the far ridge, a warning. A scout from a rival tribe had been seen near the border, one with ties to old blood feuds. Years ago, Tuckoda had made enemies by protecting lands others sought to claim. And now, word had reached those old enemies that a foreigner had passed the sacred rite. That kind of change made powerful men uneasy. And uneasy men don't whisper, they act. Tuckoda gathered the council, and for the first time, asked Caleb to sit among them. The warriors shifted, some unsure, but none objected. Caleb didn't speak for himself. He waited until all voices had been heard, until threats were counted, borders drawn, and fears confessed. Then, with his hands still dusted from the field, he said, "If they come for me, let them find a man who does not hide. But if they come for this, for what we've built, then let them find all of us standing as one." It was the first time Tuckoda nodded in agreement without needing to speak, and the moment did not go unnoticed. From that point on, something in the air shifted. The old order was still intact, but now it carried new weight. The idea that leadership could come from beyond blood, earned not by war, but by witness, had taken root. The circle was no longer just a symbol. It was alive. In the days that followed, young warriors trained harder. Children asked deeper questions. Songs around the fire began to include new verses, ones that spoke not only of chiefs and victories, but of farmers and faith. Even the medicine women began teaching girls that strength could look like standing your ground without raising a blade. The rhythm of the tribe was changing, not loudly, not violently, but with the steady power of truth passed hand to hand. And in the center of it all stood Wiaka and Caleb, not above the tribe, not outside it, but within it, rooted not by obligation, but by choice. They were no longer the ones who had broken tradition. They were the ones who had replanted it. And as the hills listened in silence, the wind carried their story farther than they would ever know. The rival tribe did come, but not with spears. They came with questions. Their chief, Nawel, rode with 5 men behind him, all cloaked in bone-gray cloth and old anger. They stopped just outside the southern ridge and sent word. "We heard your circle now opens to strangers," the message read. "We come to see what price you paid for peace." Many feared the encounter would undo everything. Some whispered that Takoda would strike first, as he had in younger days. But Takoda only looked at Caleb and nodded. It was Caleb who rode out first, with Wiaka at his side. No armor, no banners, just 2 hands joined together between tribes who had once shed blood. Nawel expected a chief. He expected a warrior. What he didn't expect was a farmer. Dust on his shoulders, a soft voice, and a steady gaze. "You come to see what we've lost," Caleb said, "but maybe you'll see what we've planted." Nawel didn't smile, but he listened. They invited Nawel and his men into the valley, not as enemies, but as witnesses. The fire was lit at the base of the canyon, and for the first time in many winters, 2 tribes sat together in silence. No treaties were signed, no promises made, but as the night deepened, Nawel watched the children play beside the same man he had once called a threat. And he saw the way Wiaka watched Caleb, not with submission, but with certainty. It unnerved him. At sunrise, Nawel approached Takoda alone. "You broke your walls," he said, "and they didn't collapse." Takoda nodded slowly. "No," he answered. "They bloomed." The rival chief left with no war declared, no fire set. Just a look back over his shoulder, a look not of defeat, but reflection. He had come expecting weakness, and left having witnessed a people stronger than ever before. In the days that followed, no scouts were seen at the border. No threats returned. And within the tribe, something unspoken settled deep in the hearts of the people. Not every war needed to be fought. Some needed only to be seen through. And sometimes, the greatest legacy a warrior could leave was not a trail of victories, but the quiet courage to let love change what tradition could not. Years passed like river songs, sometimes rushing, sometimes still. Children who had once watched from the shadows now ran through the same paths their ancestors feared. Wiaka and Caleb built their home not far from the canyon, where the winds carried both warning and wisdom. It was no palace, just a cabin with open windows, herbs drying from the ceiling, and stories tucked into every corner. People visited often, not to honor them, but to remember. Takoda, now older and slower, stepped down as chief not with ceremony, but with trust. He named no successor. He simply said, "Let the circle choose." And the circle did. For the first time in the tribe's history, a council was formed, guided not by blood, but by story, by balance, by those who had lived through change and stayed. Wiaka led without leading. Caleb guided without command. Together, they became something the old songs never described, but the land recognized: keepers. One spring, during a planting festival, a girl no older than 10 asked Caleb, "Were you afraid the night they called you an outsider?" He knelt beside her, dirt still on his hands. "Yes," he said, "but not of them. I was afraid I'd never be more than what the world expected me to be." The girl nodded and gave him flour. "My mother says you made the ground soft again." Caleb smiled. "No, we did. That was the true legacy. Not the kiss. Not the right. Not even the night the warriors stood down. It was the softening. The way the tribe learned to listen. To bend without breaking. To teach without wounding. And to let old wounds heal. Not with silence, but with stories that honored pain without becoming prisoners to it. And so, under that ever-watching sky, the poor farmer and the daughter of the chief did not build a kingdom. They built something harder. They built a future. And in the Old West, there was no greater revolution than that. Time, in the valley, moved like roots beneath the soil, quiet, slow, unshakable. Children born after the kiss never knew a world where Caleb was a stranger. They saw him as part of the land, the same as the river or the ridgeline. His voice, once uncertain, became the voice of the fields, of story circles, of evening songs beneath open sky. And Wiaka, ever watchful, ever steady, became the one who reminded the people to feel before they judged, to remember that every law was once born from a choice. Each year, the people gathered at the base of the canyon, not for battle, but for remembrance. They called it the Night of the Walk, a time when those old enough to understand would trace the same path Caleb once walked blindfolded, not to prove themselves, but to meet themselves. And at the end of each walk, they left something behind in the clearing, a bead, a feather, a truth. The canyon became a sacred mirror, and Caleb's story, once taboo, had become teaching. One year, a young man named Enoki, proud, sharp-tongued, son of one of Tukota's last surviving warriors, spoke aloud at the gathering. How can a love story change a people? There was no anger in his voice, only doubt. And yet the silence that followed felt heavy. Wiaka approached him, carrying no staff, no symbol of power, just a folded cloth. Inside, the red feather Caleb had carried from the canyon all those years ago. She handed it to Enoki and said, because it was never just love. It was conviction. And conviction shapes what war never could. Enoki stood frozen, the feather in his palm like a coal that did not burn, but warmed. He didn't respond. He didn't have to. That night, he placed the feather at the canyon's edge, next to his father's name carved into wood. A gesture, a bridge, proof that even doubt could find peace inside the circle, if it walked far enough. And so, another layer was added to the legacy, one not just of transformation, but of continuity. Caleb and Wiaka, now older, didn't lead with their voices anymore. Others had taken up that path, but their presence remained the center, like a stone in the river, steady, constant, shaping the flow around them, not by command, but simply by enduring. And in a land where so many stories ended in blood, theirs endured because it had been born of truth and fed by choice, over and over again. Years turned into decades, and one day, beneath the amber light of late summer, the tribe gathered for a new reason, not of fear, not of reckoning, but of farewell. Caleb had passed in his sleep, Wiaka beside him, his hand still holding hers as it had from the very beginning. There were no cries that morning, no morning drums, only quiet, the kind of quiet that carries gratitude and weight, the kind that feels like the land itself is bowing in respect. They buried him at the edge of the canyon, where stone met sky. Wiaka stood before the gathered tribe, her back straight, her braids silvered with time. He came to us with nothing, she said, and gave us everything, not in gifts, not in power, but in presence. He stayed, and because of that, so much healed. She knelt and placed the original red cloth over his chest, the same one from the right, time-worn, soft as wind. The people wept, not because he was gone, but because he had become part of them. Wiaka lived many more years. She continued telling stories, continued teaching the children, continued reminding the tribe that strength is not what you hold in your hand, but what you release without losing yourself. And when she too returned to the earth, they buried her beside Caleb, beneath a tree that had grown tall above his grave, without ever having been planted. The wind, it seemed, had known where roots belonged, and so the land kept telling their story. Travelers came from far away, seeking the place where the chief's daughter kissed a poor farmer and changed the course of a people. They expected monuments. They found only a circle of stones, a tree, and a path that led into silence. But those who stayed long enough always left changed, because the truth still lived there, just as it always had, not carved into walls, but carried in hearts. In the end, their story wasn't about a kiss. It was about what followed, about the courage to stand still, the power to choose love over legacy. And the legacy that love leaves behind when no one's looking. In a land shaped by blood, loyalty, and unbending tradition, one choice changed everything, not through battle or rebellion, but through the quiet courage of a woman who followed her heart and a man who never let his spirit bend beneath the weight of judgment. Wiaka and Caleb's story was not a story of conquest, but of conviction. In a world where so many lived by what they inherited, they dared to live by what they believed. And because of that, the land itself listened. Their journey taught a lesson older than any law carved in bark or stone, that sometimes the strongest warriors are the ones who refuse to raise a weapon, and the deepest revolutions begin with love that simply refuses to retreat. What began as a kiss under stars ended as a seed planted in generations, growing not in defiance, but in quiet resilience. They showed that healing does not come from force, but from presence, from staying when it would be easier to walk away, from speaking when silence has always been expected. The tribe did not lose its identity. It expanded it, because when truth is honored, tradition doesn't die, it deepens. Wiaka's choice reminded her people that honor without compassion is only pride in disguise. Caleb's walk through the canyon reminded them that sometimes the outsider carries the most sacred truth of all, not because he knows their stories, but because he's willing to walk through them. Together, they became a bridge between what was and what could be. And if their story moved something in you, if it reminded you of someone you've loved despite the odds, or of a moment where you stood still when the world demanded you run, then don't let this tale end here. These stories live because they are shared. Leave your mark in the comments. Tell us what this journey made you feel. Subscribe to walk with us through more stories like this one. And like this video if it lit something quiet and steady inside your chest. Because in the end, the West never belonged to the loudest voices. It belonged to those who had the strength to love, even when it meant standing alone. And that kind of love echoes forever.